My name's Dr. Cadence Kinsey, and I'm saying doctor because Roja likes it when I say doctor. And I work in the History of Art department at UCL, and I've been working on this show with Roja and Tom here at Academics, and this really kind of extends a number of events and publications that we've worked on together for the last couple of years, and we're lucky that Maja has agreed to spend some time and talk with us about the show. But before I sort of begin the conversation with Maja, I thought it might be helpful to give not an introduction to the show and to Maja's work, because we have her here, and so I think it's more appropriate for her to do that, but maybe to say a little bit about one aspect of my own research, with the hope that it might offer some context for this conversation and why it made sense for us to work together with Arcadia Missa on this exhibition. So something that I am particularly interested in my own research is the development of what are often quite conflicting narratives, particularly discursive narratives, around the web and digital technology more widely. And one important strand of my research has been to look at the origins of ideas around collaboration, co-creation, participation, and of course each of these is quite highly particular in its scope and historical significance. And really think about the ways in which these terms have represented competing but parallel ideological positions. So on the one hand, participation has been conceived in terms of the decentralization and democratization of information sharing, and this is kind of generally covered by the term network publics. But on the other, it has also been thought about in relation to histories of work transfer, which historically referred to automation and de-skilling, but more recently has also come to be associated with the removal of paid labour, as per the terms the prosumer or playber, which I know everybody here is probably familiar with, so sorry for the repetition, but obviously these refer not only to the production or sharing of content within applications or websites, so commenting, reviewing, uploading, but also with more basic actions associated with the use of them, clicking, liking, sharing, following, and so on. So there is this kind of unresolved tension between commercial optimization and open source ethics in the discourses of participation. And it is the coincidence of these two positions that produces a series of ambiguities that I think are really quite interesting to look at, particularly in the context of recent art. Although this conversation really begins right at the end of the 1990s, it has probably been in the last 5 years or so that this has really entered the discourses of art in a significant way. And this has manifested itself as a fairly consistent inquiry into ideas around labour in the web economy, much of which has been indebted to the tradition of Italian autonomous Marxism. Now, where my research is mostly positioned is not necessarily on those projects which make work about the digital economy, but which actually bear some kind of structuring relationship to it. Something that I find incredibly compelling is the idea that artists are a part of, rather than apart from, the kinds of economies that they're exploring. And this can figure in different ways. So when I met with Maja in New York in the summer, at the beginning of the summer, we spoke a little bit about Airbnb. I just arrived in New York and was having a bit of a bad experience with my hosts, because one of them had been up all night playing music really loud as he got ready for the Coney Island Mermaid Parade. And it was also the time when Airbnb had just released their advertising campaign across the subway saying New Yorkers agree, Airbnb is great for New York City. And in talking about the particular significance of Airbnb for New York, Maja happened to mention just how important it was for artists as well, and for yourself, for providing them with an income to sustain their practice. So suddenly the sharing economy does not simply enter art at the level of subject matter or representative content, but it actually somehow structures the backdrop to its production more generally. And for me, this produces quite a high stakes field of inquiry, because it means reassessing some of our most basic assumptions about the category of art, such as the question of art's autonomy. So it is really this relationship between the work and the conditions of its production which has become increasingly of interest to me, as it puts quite a different spin on the idea of participation. But this is also something that I know that Maja has been very interested in exploring in her wider practice. So looking at the conditions of production, plotting the edges of image making, and much of your work has seemed to me to grapple with questions around access or technological capabilities of representation, what are its limits, What are its possibilities? And I think this is something that we saw you do in your duo solo show with Dora back in February 2013. Yeah. So the plan for this conversation is really to look in a bit more detail at some of these ideas in relation to the show here. So perhaps to think a little bit about how the ideologies of the web economy might correspond to artistic production, but also to unpack this idea of participation a little through this idea of doing what you love and loving what you do. So maybe I could just begin by asking you to say, just what is Do What You Love, DWYL, and to talk us a little bit through the film, which is the main piece of the show, and maybe kind of explain some of the particular narrative sequences that we see throughout the film.
Cool. Well, maybe just to kind of like explain a little bit the background of the video. The first part was filmed the night before the iPhone 6 release in front of the Apple Store, and the second part was shot on the day of the release. And this this kind of like this event served as like a scenography for like meeting this fictional character Alex, where she kind of like interacts with the situation and kind of starts explaining her very subjective position and talking about like the newness, the technology and the work, and being passionate towards the thing that you do. And the DWYL, or Do What You Love, is kind of represented as like a work ideology that's closely associated to entrepreneurship and like startup culture, that's somewhat specific to the American kind of like production, but I think it is also like a little bit more universal. And Alex is a fictional character, feels like doing what you love is somewhat like of an oppressive work ideology that in a real world doesn't really like function as that. And at the end of the video she's rehearsing the Indiegogo campaign, where she's kind of trying to establish main arguments about doing what you like, kind of attitude towards the work. And the actual campaign is also online. The point of like putting the actual campaign online at the Indiegogo is not as much as to like gather the funds, as much as it is the goal of that to kind of like have Alex as a fictional character extend from the video format and to be part of like a different kind of participation online.
I mean, Alex is quite an interesting character to watch. I don't know what other people's responses were as they watched the video, but you know, as I mentioned to you before, there's something quite impassive about her, and I think this brings a bit of an ambiguity to the piece. So on the one hand, you can kind of almost sort of read Alex as buying into that, or being a victim of an ideology of doing what you love. You know, she wants that. She wants to be doing what she loves, and so she sets up this Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign to enable herself to do just that. But then on the other, there's also this kind of critique of that that's embedded in the film, and I think we see this in the voiceover narrative at the beginning, where there's almost like this sense of despair. She's talking about technology, but also the fact that she is kind of pushing DWYL like right to its limits, like even exploiting it. And I felt when I was watching this that it was almost like she was calling its bluff, saying, okay, here is what this technology promises, let's kind of see what it can do.
Yeah, I think like this first part of the video that was shot on the day of release is kind of showing the real picture of what this iPhone release is as an event. And very often in media it's like not presented that like people who are actually waiting in the line are being paid by corporations to stand in the line and promote their kind of like a product, and then the rest of the people were like people who are like middle-aged and the whole Chinese families that wait there kind of like to resell the product because it becomes available in China 10 months after, and it has like a higher value actually as a product. And yeah, to get back to
Okay. I was wondering if you could maybe say something about that ambiguity around the character of Alex, like, and her position in relation to this DWYL.
Yeah, well, she as a character was trying to like establish like a position where she's talking about certain things, maybe in a critical sense at some points, and even negative, and but kind of like she rebels against the things she's talking about. And her putting up the Indiegogo campaign is kind of like an emancipatory actually like act in compared to everything that she kind of like explains in the first part of the video.
So I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the Indiegogo campaign in the film is that Alex is using technology to free up time, but of course we know that in fact technology actually tends to take up time and to make us do more work, or to make more for us, and this is what makes DWYL so oppressive, right? It knows that if you love what you do, you were sort of likely to do far too much of it and for increasingly little reward. And in the context of the web, I think we see this really manifesting itself in the emergent working cultures of the new economy of the late 1990s, particularly the tech and startup industries, which is obviously a significant part of this film, where work becomes more like play. And of course this is also in the premise of social media itself, that if it's social, it's more like leisure time than work time. So I wanted to ask you about the importance of not working in the film, and how this figures in the film, and again the fact that this perhaps gives the piece some kind of ambiguity, because although not working is a state of maximum work, as it is sort of implemented through DWYL, it's also can be seen as a traditional interventionist strategy, and being unproductive can be a radical position to take. So I wonder if you can say something about not working.
Well, I mean, it was very hard to describe the point of doing the Indiegogo campaign in a way, because I think it was very hard to explain to a lot of people what is the point of campaign where she's actually not offering the product, and just explaining that she's like offering an idea, and the idea is not to work with something. It was extremely hard to actually explain in a way, and I think this is like where like her campaign becomes like a little bit like emancipatory and kind of like a refusal to do work. And I think like user comments are probably going to be pretty negative to that, because she's like using this platform that is used to like launch certain products, and that are usually like advertised towards like towards people who create them, as they're like doing something that they love, and she's kind of like trying to not do. So.
And of course there's this interesting relationship as well with not working in the histories of art as well, like you were telling me when we were talking yesterday about art strikes, and thinking about that moment of not working in art and the kind of critical significance of doing that.
True. I mean, like just like watching a little bit through the history, I think like maybe like one reference that I think is like close to me is Croatian artist Mladen Stilinovic, who did a performance of not working in the 70s. And thinking of that, I think like Indiegogo is kind of like a relevant place where like somebody is like actually protesting by not working or producing a certain product.
And the other facet to this idea of unproductive labour is also that obviously that's a label that has been applied to art more generally, that art is a form of not working in the sense that it's unproductive. You know, it's historically characterised as not having a use value in the same sense as something like a can opener or a car or something like that. And this is sort of supposedly what constitutes its distinction from commercial enterprises, so the realm of the product. So this is why art is kind of different to products, and that is what underwrites the idea of art's autonomy. So maybe just to develop that a little, one of the things that strikes me is that there is also an important relationship between DWYL culture and artistic activity, and I know this is something that maybe I might be a little bit more interested in than you are particularly, but that connection between doing what you love and artistic culture via art's historical distinction from work as a form of unalienated labour. And this is also true for academia, so kind of both art and academia are in a way kind of like institutionalised forms of DWYL. I don't know if you want to...
I think that part that we talked about was very interesting, and the parallel you made between like the attitude towards work that comes from art or academia, and like became part of like the startup culture, like doing what you love. I think that's like a really interesting part, if you want.
So maybe at this point it might be worth talking a little bit about the importance of Airbnb in the film, which just sort of features in that moment where there's the overlay of the shots of Alex walking around the apartment, and you see the Airbnb logo. So maybe going back to what I mentioned at the beginning about you yourself at times having relied on Airbnb as a source of income, and I wondered whether this connection between DWYL and art kind of added that extra layer to the work and extended some of the questions in your wider practice really about your interest in that relationship between the work and the conditions of its production.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of like the monologue from Alex is coming from my experience by working in different structures than like art practice, and also like just to give like a little bit of background, Alex, who is the main actor, she's like a first generation of Russian immigrants in United States, and she grew up in a system that was completely different, and I think her idea of like joy and work is like way more separated than like it would be if she probably grew up in New Jersey where she spent like last 30 years of her life. So I think that's somehow how she like actually became the character.
And just to say a little bit more maybe about the particularities of Airbnb. So something that is of interest to me is how Airbnb represents that kind of meeting point of some of those competing ideologies that I spoke about at the outset. So this kind of moment of participation being conceived within terms of an open source ethic, but also as a moment of the kind of commercialization of participation. And something that I know you mentioned to me before, that a text that you were interested in, the Soul, Franco Berardi's Soul of Work text, where he's talking about the kind of the internalization of the working process, so work becomes personal. And I wondered if you might say something about how for you that connects to something like Airbnb.
Yeah, well, I think like it's interesting how like Airbnb like kind of like opposes these two places where in a video it like becomes like a part where like Alex as a character is being introduced through like her user profile on Airbnb, and it's also like a transition from like an exterior to her apartment, and it's used as like a way to like kind of like personalize her, but it's like a user profile that she uses to kind of like sublet her space. Yeah.
No, go on, sorry.
No, yeah.
Sorry, it's kind of like your, I mean, well, it's a change in personal identity, isn't it? And this kind of like break down the distinctions between public and private, that's something like DWYL kind of instigates, and then you know, it's your domestic space, it's your personal space, it's your personal identity, but then it takes on this other aspect.
Yeah, well, for example, like the titles on the screens are kind of like used to like show Alex as a user profile, and from that point on her space is being kind of like exploited to like build like an Indiegogo campaign, and she's also like showed as like a place that she like Airbnb, so it's being like completely kind of taken a use of in like a complete participation through like building a campaign and to like subletting the space. Yeah.
So, okay, so we've spoken a little bit about this idea of doing what you love and not working, and that far from being liberatory, it's actually quite an oppressive ideology, quite an oppressive structure that tends to mask or disguise the fact that you are working quite a lot and more than you should be. But in the show there are other kind of related models of working that you bring up, and one of these is this idea of working for free. So for example, when you contribute in some way to a website, like writing reviews.
Sorry to interrupt. I think like one of the ways of like working for free that's like described in a video is the part that's a YouTube footage of users breaking the iPhone 6. Those were all the kind of like people who are like prescribers who like text the phone and usually break it in like a really brutal way to show its functionality. It's also like kind of like a way of like a free labor in a way.
Yeah, and I like how you described it to me about it's like iPhone torture, isn't it? But also the fact that that's something that connects in quite interesting ways with not a lot, but some art practice as well, right? Where people are actually kind of attacking the screen in quite a physical way. So because there is that connection, there is that other form of kind of you know, those new models. One other of the examples of those new models of working that features in the film with the iPhone product testing reviews, and that obviously represents a different kind of consumer engagement. So I just wondered if maybe you might then also say something about the Bic book as well, which is on show here in the corner in relation to that.
Sure. I mean, just when you were talking about this, I remembered to mention one thing. I think in the first few scenes, I think all the performances that like appear in a video are like actually working at a time, because it's shot at the Apple store, and there is like a scene with the people who work there, but there is also like a scene with people who are waiting in a line, and kind of like the outcome of that is kind of like actually like selling the product or reselling it. And I think that like kind of comes in the line. And then on the day of the release, there is like a part which is kind of trying to like establish the hierarchy of the screens, where there is like a couple of scenes of like users taking photos of an event and news reporters. And it's really interesting because there is like this idea of like the value of the screen and the hierarchy, and like the idea of the value of the technology. But in a way, everybody's like taking the same image, and the resolution is like a minimal size difference in a way. So yeah.
And could you say something about the book, maybe?
The book Thinner Barrel, it's a compilation of all the user comments from Amazon that was collected under the product Big, which is like kind of like a custom pens producer that did like a line of pens which was called Big for Her, and it was made like 5 years ago. Those were like pink pens which were like made a little bit from like a thinner plastic, and they were like a little bit thinner, and they were advertised as having a thinner barrel and like stronger grip for like a female hand. And it was like a really big thing on Amazon because there is like a 2,000 of user comments that kind of approach this product from really different parts of like there is like people who are like kind of like writing really humorous comments, to like people who are pasting like pages of their PhD thesis on like kind of like a gender and product identity. So it's kind of like becomes this like a collection of arguments that could be used in kind of like a critique of like a gender identity and like a branding and a product, written in a really simple language. Yeah.
One of the things that I'm interested in is that I mean, reviews are this kind of non-monetary form of engagement with the consumer, but then like Roja was saying yesterday, reviews obviously then become currency, so they kind of go from being non-monetary to actually having this kind of they do end up kind of indexing the market in some way, don't they?
True, yeah. I think the outcome was, I think it's impossible to buy it in a retail in United States now, but definitely like just compiling the book and going to 2,000 comments, it like really becomes like obvious that this was like so much work kind of like that was put into like defining this as a product from a user side.
And I still haven't managed to like really formulate it as a question, but I mentioned it to you before that I was kind of interested to ask you about survival and how survival figures in this film. So there's a scene in the film where Alex says, if you're like me, you depend on work for your living, and this is taking up 80% of your time and 80% of your energy, and she's asking for people to kind of like charge her up in some way, and this brought to mind themes of preservation and survival, and I just wondered if that was something that you were interested in relation to this,
well,
but I haven't really formulated it.
Well, I think she as a character, the way she like talks about like survival is like in relation that she's like doesn't own really anything, and like borrowing or like using or like renting things is like her like form of participation or like taking part in different elements.
So that's how she survives in these new economies. And of course, like if you don't own anything, then how do you belong, right? You have this kind of correlation between belonging through belongings, and then if you don't have that, then you can take on this sort of fluid identity that can kind of move and change, perhaps.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. Okay, so just to finish up, then really the last thing I wanted to ask you about was the title, Facing the Same Direction, and I just wondered if you could say something.
Well, the title mostly like I think it's like most like kind of like defined in that like scene of like the release of an iPhone where there is like so many like cameras passing by and like capturing the same moment. It's just like an idea of like simultaneous participation through screens and kind of like being the part of the same event, but looking this image on a screen.
Okay, so there's kind of focus of this at this particular point.
Yeah, or just like also like a participation on like different like platforms where Alex takes part, like both like Airbnb and Indiegogo, and just this idea of like simultaneous participation that happens.
So I know like I'm particularly interested in technology and work, so the conversation has been quite focused on that, but Maja's agreed to answer a few questions if anybody wants to ask anything or open up the conversation to other themes. There's obviously lots of different ways that the conversation could be taken, I think.
Maybe it'd be good to talk a bit more about why doing the Indiegogo campaign as well, and how that formally relates to video installation, like the reasons you talked about that.
Yeah. Well, I think like kind of like similar to the book Thinner Barrel. I think the idea of like extending Alex as a fictional character and taking part in an Indiegogo campaign is to kind of like get a feedback or like get like a commentary from the users who use that platform on her idea not to work and participate in that. I think like the idea is not to like collect like the financial like funds from the campaign, and I think realistically it would be extremely hard. So she doesn't really want to like kind of like participate in the same way as like the products and startups are competing at the Indiegogo, but to kind of like share this idea of not working.
You mentioned to me also about that you were interested in distribution and the question of different distribution possibilities for the video. Have I understood that right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of interested in the context and the different contexts of the Indiegogo campaign versus the film.
Yeah.
Could you maybe say that?
I mean, I think like for like somebody who might like run into like Indiegogo's campaign online, I think it might be like a completely different experience than like seeing the whole video, like having the whole context. But I think like a lot of products that are like advertised there are like trying to start up or like really similar to like the kind of like an iPhone in the way they like approach to the user, but promising to kind of like save time by buying the product and like being engaged to like extremely like a new the product like actually like saves time in a way. Yeah.
And the campaign is now live.
Yeah, campaign is now live. Yeah.
And has anybody?
To be honest, I didn't really even check if anybody contributed, because it somehow feels like it's not like really a goal of the campaign. But I'll definitely check in like a couple of months, like to see the user comments. Yeah.
Also, maybe hypothetically, like what happens if it is successful as a campaign, and also like what are the prizes and what are prizes? They're not even prizes; they're like rewards.
Yeah, sure. So like the campaign has like perks like every other campaign, and most of the perks are like the awards for like people who would be potential backers are kind of like the images that are like also presented here in a space but taken like a different like kind of like material, different like form, from like desktop backgrounds to like a poster. Then there is like a possibility of like hiring Alex to do like an hour-long lecture or a talk via Skype, and the main prize is Alex's Airbnb account with good reviews actually. So if somebody would have to like back up the campaign, they would actually win her Airbnb, which is originally my Airbnb but with a changed name and like good reviews.
I think that like then becomes a currency, because on Airbnb, you've got good reviews, you can rent your apartment better. Yeah, somebody could easily put up the photos like in London or like in Shanghai from their apartment and use the same reviews in a way.
Can I just ask, for someone who's not in the least evolved art-wise, so what you've done is, on this Indiegogo, if I went there, I'd come up with this, and I would think it was real. There'd be nothing to suggest to me that it was an art piece. Yeah, is that right?
That's right.
And then, so what happens, because it'd be an evolving art piece, won't it? As comics and things are added to it, it will be shifting and changing. What will you then do with that? I mean, partly, you said to Roja that, okay, there'll be certain things that people might get from it or whatever, but then at some other point, will you do the big reveal, or will the user comments become a book, or, what happens then?
I think like the potential of like user comments becoming book is like the one that's like most realistic to happen in a way, and definitely like the user comments are going to be like the value that comes out of this campaign. And the option that Alex would do like a lecture or an online thing is kind of like a way how like this could like maybe like spread or like grow to somewhere else. So that is a possibility. Yeah.
So would you like it to become a movement? She suggests this can become a movement. Is that something you're playing with?
I mean, I think it's like a really dangerous thing. But yeah, I think it would be interesting, like to have Alex as a fictional character actually do a lecture. I think that would be great. Yeah.
But also, like, what happens, so hypothetically, it's a successful campaign, like we were talking about it and we were thinking, actually, you're going to get trolled, you know, like, it's going to be, you know, people aren't going to like it. But if it was, like, actually went the other way and it was a successful campaign, like, I guess also kind of, like, what happens with the money, and Alex is an actress and how she relates to you and stuff. I think people are probably interesting because there's always like this overwhelming question of ethics.
We spoke a lot about whether to go into
sorry,
No, it's like a legitimate question, like how would like the funding like be kind of like split if there was actually any. It would, I mean, I think like Alex and me did like the most of the work and like producing this, and we would kind of like equally probably like split the funds, except like if Alex was to do a lecture, she would actually like get the funds for doing it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Because for me, like, obviously I'm really interested in this like conflation of when it actually kind of becomes, you know, it's a way of sort of producing the work itself. And you know, when you were telling me that Anna, the actress who plays Alex, like she's doing a PhD, like at first when I thought, okay, she's an actress, and it's like, yeah, well, acting is another example, like art, of this kind of, you know, it's something you do because you love it, and so you're happy to do jobs for free. And then you said, well, no, she's actually doing a PhD in art criticism, and it's like that even more kind of is the sorts of things I'm interested in about the fact that art, academia, all of these models of a kind of, as I said before, like an institutionalized form of DWYL culture that then the film itself is trying to ask those questions of. And you sort of said how this, that this money can then go to pay her. So it's like that crowdfunding campaign is actually making this possible. So you have that mirroring at the level of kind of content and the context of production as well. But yeah, we spoke a lot about whether to go into that or whether it's just a bit too kind of convoluted.
Yeah, well, I still think that like kind of like the most important part about like the campaign would be actually to kind of like see how this campaign like grows inside of like the Indiegogo platform, which has like such a like kind of like strict like attitude of how the product or an ideas are presented and like what is valuable to like bring to the world in a way.
Yeah, what is value? Any other question?
I have a question that's quite a simple question really. It's about the selection of Airbnb as a shared economy platform, and was that because of your direct experience using it, and if you use other shared economy platforms, do you think there's any distinction there with that who loves something embedded in exploitation, or if in your work you're particularly interested in lifestyle, and so that's the reason you selected Airbnb? Just to talk about Airbnb in a wider context, shared economy models that might be useful to artists. That's obviously one of the main ones, because very often artists will be travelling in them things and those things, so they use it. I don't know if you use other ones as well.
Well, I think like the Airbnb one is used because I'm probably like most familiar with, and I think it's like the one that like actually like most kind of like takes over like your private space. And actually I was like at one lecture maybe like 2 weeks ago, and they were like talking about Airbnb and like the like new changing of like the Airbnb as a brand, and trying to kind of like get users to sell objects in their home to like people who actually visit it. And it's a really dangerous thing, because I think like there is like a huge like separation between like, for example, their like brand philosophy, which is like called Bella, the sense of belonging, where they're trying to kind of like advertise that Airbnb is bringing people together. And on the other hand, I think in realistic context, I think like people are more likely to rent their apartment on Airbnb than to have their friends stay for free for 2 weeks, if that is like the way they're like making money, or like kind of like keeping sustainable with. So I think this is like really interesting about how this idea of sharing economy is like actually like having like this like really polarizing effects. Yeah.
But I think also there's quite a conflict at the moment with that whole idea when you think about just, I don't know what it's like living in New York, but living in London, and the pressure on housing and the costs, you know, for anybody to live. It's all right for my generation, but it isn't for yours, you know. So do we end up selling slices of our home so that you have these transient people moving around having little slots of their lives in sort of spaces because they can't actually buy a whole space, even rental wise, for prolonged periods of time, you know. It can become quite a kind of dystopian idea, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think it already is like a really like a dystopian idea, but like for a really short period of time, for people who are like renters, it allowed to kind of like make some money or like accumulate some like value from it. But on a long term, it's like has like a lot of negative effects. Yeah.
But I also think with Maja's video, like the opening feels like it feels very dystopian, but that it's like our present, we are already living in the end times, but it's this kind of like you said, she's really impassive, and it's kind of, it's not like apocalypse, like exciting, it's just like there and present and lived in.
In terms of Indiegogo, do they like try to like stop people operating under false premises? Like, is there terms and conditions that like tries to stop this sort of campaign where someone's pretending to be something that they're not?
I heard that like they have like people who like work and check out all the videos, so somebody wouldn't be asking crowdsourcing money to like put a bomb somewhere or do something that's like completely unethical. But they didn't have any problems with like for example, Alex has like a fake Gmail address, for example. That worked fine. So a fictional character.
Like slip through the gaps, and like, is it your intent then to like destabilize it from the inside?
Yeah, but the thing is, to something that Candice was talking about, I think like campaigns that have people who have like their real addresses and real profiles and kind of like participate on all levels of like social economy are actually like the ones that are like most successful. So I think like this idea of like transparency, like not hiding your identity, I think it's something that it's more successful on it.
I wanted to ask a bit about the scripting, because the bit that really stuck with me was, I think, at the end of Alex's video when she says like, support me so that you can, I can't remember exactly what it's like, but so that you can possibly also like do what you love. And it like, it's just so nonsense, like, do you know what I mean? With this idea that by supporting that, you somehow will also be able to do that, and it's really like TED Talk or something, but I just wanted to know like how you did that.
But I think maybe you're talking about like the part where she says like where she like compares that like contributing the campaign will be the same as like borrowing somebody's phone charger and returning it back.
Yeah, she makes these crazy leaps.
Well, I think like the idea was to like refer to like this idea of like renting your like apartment on Airbnb, or just like kind of like trading and participating with things that like you don't have an ownership of, and I hope that answers. But also like
activating your money to like support someone, so then that somehow the money can be mobilized through an person.
But I think like also that like the idea to like not to work is like something that's something that would make people angry more than anything.
Except she does make a very good point about the kind of distinctions between working and not working, not being hard fast anymore. You know, we all have work leading into what used to be off-time. I remember a day when it was like that. Way back in the past. It doesn't happen like that anymore.
It seems to me that we might be in the midst of a new industrial revolution where instead of manual labour being replaced by machines, cognitive labour is replaced by automation and computation. The logical conclusion of which would be a post-work economy. What do you think about the way that forms of labour are changing through the acceleration of technology, and are you interested in the idea that maybe we might not work anyway through an acceleration of capitalism, as opposed to resistance?
I actually think that like Cadence at one point gave like a really good like answer to this question. I mean, I would try to find like an easy way out.
I
don't
agree, because the thing is like, yeah, cognitive labour, but for cognitive labour to exist, there's shitloads of manual labour in the rest of the world. You know, just because we're in the West and we're like, oh, all our work is participation online, you know, there's still like servers and like material consequences on the planet, but also like people have to do that. And like also loads of like clicks and likes that like done by like mechanical turks, which are people that are like, you know, uploading photos and things for like 1p, which is like not in the West. So it's like, I don't know, I can't envisage that as being like, as post-work being a real outcome, especially when all of this like unpaid labour is essentially work. Like, you know, just as with like, yeah, autonomous, like feminist autonomous critique, it's just like, well, it's still work. You're still rearing children, you're still, all the affect of labour is still work. So I can't agree.
It's still work, but the forms of labour have changed, right?
Yeah, but it's still labour.
Yeah. Maybe just to like mention that, because it's like very close to like do what you love, and I think it's like kind of like a new kind of like work ideology that's being kind of like represented to like startup companies, to like co-working spaces, which and that kind of like perpetuate this idea that like all work is cognitive, and that this is like somehow like a movement forward in the time, or like a development. I don't think that's really true, because I think this is like true to like a small segment of people, but this is not something that's like a general development in a way.
Yeah, one of the things that's quite interesting in the literature is that so many scholars are quite indebted or quite invested in trying to prove why these aren't kind of new forms of labour or new forms of exploitation. So I kind of mentioned the histories of work transfer, which I think is relevant in terms of your point about automation. And people are really, really invested in trying to plot how this is just one moment of a very, very long history, from supermarket checkouts, and you're not taking things off the shelf yourself or someone else, you know, all of these things. And you just got to kind of ask yourself, well, what are the stakes of trying to map those histories, and to say it's new or to say it's not new, I think is quite an interesting thing.
I think also you should talk to Julia Chalfers. She gave a really interesting talk where she was describing like NASA's kind of works with like students to be, not students, they're probably like on PhDs, like serious adults, but being like imagining like life on the moon, and they have this whole program of imagining what life will be on the moon, and it's also part of an idea that like technology is going to help us like leave this planet and be able to carry on with just like the rinsing, which is like pure capitalism. And so within that you would think that they'd be imagining like not work, yet Julia was showing these like plans, and it's all just the same kind of like segmentation of society. So you have like the gym, so it's like entertainment, like work, and you know, kind of heteronormative like families. So it's just like, even in like the imagination of NASA, what would look like on the moon is basically a reflection of society now, even though to do that would require so much technology. So it's also in like, what is our collective imagination? Probably quite shit.
We thank Maja.
Thank you.